It started, as some tragedies do, with a fluttering card and a vanished truth, the kind hidden behind stage smoke, whispered in Hungarian and stitched into the silence between survival and guilt. In a brownstone on West 35th, illusion was not merely entertainment, it was defense, confession, and eventually the final betrayal. One woman remembered too late. One man forgot too well. And between them stood a magician who never pulled the trigger, but still built the theatre of death. Before we begin, I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from and what time it is for you right now. Let me know in the comments. Settle in, because this mystery begins now. You could have draped that ballroom in money and still not matched the sheen on some of the guests' shoes. The Van Wyck Hotel had rolled out its red carpet, literal and metaphorical, for a private soiree billed as an evening of European enchantment. I'd been invited on the pretext of press credentials, though the only press I intended to apply was on my own shoe leather if things got dull. They hadn't, not yet. The place was thick with satin gowns, cufflinks, and enough cultured laughter to start a small war in the Midwest. I slipped through the crowd like a man with a purpose, which was my usual camouflage. In reality, I was doing what I do best: watching. I saw a city councilman try to avoid his mistress and fail. I watched a famous sculptor fumble his wine, and I spotted two familiar faces from the club scene trying hard to pretend they didn't know each other. The only person not pretending to be someone else was me, and even that took effort. I was there to see a man billed as the magician of Budapest, but I had a hunch he wasn't the only one dealing in illusions tonight. He stepped onto the stage with the kind of quiet that silences its own echo. Emil Kardos, tall, lean, wearing a black suit tailored to imply money but not taste. The cape was crimson-lined, and so was the smile. He didn't bow, didn't greet the audience. He looked at us, slowly from one end of the ballroom to the other, as if memorizing the faces of people he would later make disappear. His voice, when it came, was low and deliberate. Hungarian by origin, but with vowels softened for export. He spoke like someone used to saying things that weren't quite true and getting thanked for it anyway. He opened with a simple card trick, one I'd seen done better at a bar off Lexington. But what Kardos lacked in novelty, he made up for in poise. His timing was impeccable, and his eyes never left the audience. Or perhaps they never left one particular woman, seated third row center, blonde, tightly wound, and trying not to be noticed. By the time he produced the card from her clutch purse, her expression had changed. And mine had too. I've never been a fan of backstage passes, but when a man's hands are faster than the eyes of a room full of financiers, I like to see where the wires are. My credentials, a counterfeit press tag I'd forgotten to unpin, got me past the velvet rope with only a nod from a teenager who hadn't yet learned suspicion. The rear hallway was dim and warm, with the lingering smell of pancake makeup and hot wires. I spotted Kardos first, his cape off, hair damp at the temples, and across from him a woman with red silk looped tight around her throat like she was hiding a scar. Their voices were low but not affectionate. Whatever language they were speaking, it ended with silence and a look that belonged in a mirror, not a conversation. Then a third figure entered, a short man in a herringbone coat who tossed a Hungarian epithet over his shoulder and stormed out, bumping into a stagehand hard enough to knock over a prop bouquet. I filed the moment away. Props were fine, but I preferred people who broke character when they thought no one was looking. Back in my seat, I waited for Kardos's grand finale, and he obliged. With theatrical solemnity, he requested a wedding ring from the audience. The man who supplied it was middle-aged, soft in the middle, and clearly regretting his choice by the time Kardos tied it into a handkerchief and held it aloft like a relic. What followed was the usual series of flourishes, the flick of a wrist, the misdirection of a free hand, a puff of dramatic smoke that smelled faintly of cinnamon. When the haze cleared, The ring was gone. So was the applause. What replaced it was a silence. Not the breathless kind you get after brilliance, but the uneasy pause of people waiting for something they weren't sure had happened. Cardos held the moment too long, just long enough for unease to thicken, then smiled and returned the ring to the man's pocket with a bow. The man smiled politely. The woman at his side didn't. And the room clapped, but only because etiquette demanded it. Magic, I've always said, works best on people who want to believe. This crowd hadn't made up its mind. The show was over and the crowd was busy forgetting it ever happened. I was considering an exit when a man in a dove-grey coat approached me with the precision of someone who didn't stumble often. Hungarian, I guessed, before he even spoke. The posture was exiled aristocracy, the eyes post-war. "My name is Miklos Harmat," he said, offering a hand and a nod. "May I trouble you for a moment of your time?" His voice had the sandpaper edge of someone fluent in several languages but comfortable in none. He glanced over his shoulder, then led me toward a corner booth near the back wall. "You are with Mr. Wolfe?" he asked, already knowing the answer. I gave him the nod he was waiting for. He didn't smile. This magician, Cardos, he is not what he claims. He is not merely an entertainer. He is something far worse. I waited. He was in Budapest during the bad years. He wore a different name then, and he made people disappear. The statement wasn't theatrical. It wasn't even angry. It was tired. The way some truths are when they've been sitting too long. Harmat didn't ask me to believe him. He asked for an introduction. "To Mr. Wolfe. I know of him. He can discern what the authorities overlook." I told him that Wolfe didn't exactly hold walk-ins, that he was a man who preferred to engage with the world from a chair, and only if the world came bearing a check. Harmat didn't blink. "I can pay, but more important, I can tell the truth. Even now that has value, does it not?" I gave him Wolfe's card, not the public one, the real one, and told him to call before noon the next day. He thanked me without smiling, which made two of us, and left through the side entrance like a man who'd used up his courage for the evening. I'd forgotten him within an hour. There'd been a show, a dinner, a detour, past the usual downtown jazz spot. By the time I got back to the brownstone, Wolfe was elbowed deep in saffron sauce, and I didn't mention Harmat at all. Until the phone rang at 2 a.m, and Lieutenant Rowcliffe asked if I knew a man named Miklos Harmat. The room was small, neat, and very final. Harmat had been found seated upright in the wing-back chair of his hotel suite, as if waiting for someone. His eyes were open, but they weren't seeing. The attending officer, a young detective who thought 3-day stubble counted as gravitas, walked me through the details with reluctant clarity. No forced entry, no struggle. A half-drunk glass of tokaji on the end table, and in his lap a fanned-out series of playing cards, not in any recognizable hand, but not random either. The jack of clubs had a red dot on its corner, almost like lipstick, or blood. In Harmat's inside coat pocket was a torn photograph, jagged along the center. The right half was missing. On the left, a much younger Harmat stood in uniform, one hand resting on the shoulder of a man whose face was now lost. I thanked the detective and said I'd pass the information to Mr. Wolfe. And as I turned to leave, I realized I'd been handed the kind of opening Wolfe didn't resist for long. Not because it was dramatic, because it was deliberate. And nothing deliberate goes unexamined on 35th Street. It was nearing 11 when I returned to the brownstone and found Wolfe seated in his chair, wide as an armory and just as armored, decimating a plate of braised squab with garlic juice. He didn't lift his head when I walked in, which I took as permission to begin my report. I gave him the full rundown, Cardos's velvet act, the woman with the red scarf, the borrowed ring trick that fell flat, and the Hungarian with the iceberg voice who'd called himself Harmat. I mentioned the man's concern about Cardos, his insistence on Wolfe's attention, and his general air of Eastern European dread. Wolfe wiped his lips with the cloth napkin and sighed. Bah, the intellectual poverty of illusionists. Their stock in trade is the manipulation of perception without the burden of substance, a circus in a dinner jacket. I reminded him the man who delivered the warning had turned up dead. That, finally, earned me a glance, not interest, a glance which, from Wolfe, was a promotional banner. I wasn't expecting miracles, but I was hoping for a flicker, anything to move the man from squab to suspicion. So I played my next card. I told him the cops had found a torn photograph in Harmat's pocket, one half missing, the other showing a man in uniform with his hand on someone else's shoulder. Wolfe's eyes didn't twitch, but the rest of him stilled. Uniform? He asked. Hungarian, I said, and recent enough to look old, but not ancient. Go on. There were also playing cards fanned out on the man's lap. Not a poker hand, more like arrangement. Now there it was, the subtle curling of Wolfe's lower lip. Not quite a sneer, something deeper, amusement perhaps, or the shadow of interest. A gesture, he murmured, without an audience. Curious. I sat down, prepared to interpret that as an invitation. He reached for the beer I'd brought and didn't thank me, which was how I knew I'd succeeded. We didn't get far before the doorbell interrupted us. Fritz answered, as always, and returned with a look that suggested indigestion. A moment later, Inspector Kramer stepped into the office, trailing a rustle of anger and the scent of overworked wool. "Don't tell me," I said. "You're just here for the beer." "I'm here because your name's on a piece of hotel stationery," he growled, holding up a folder. "With a corpse?" Miklos Harmat Wolfe leaned back in his chair with a sigh that suggested the arrival of a tax auditor. Kramer dropped the folder on Wolfe's desk. "Toxicology shows scopolamine and cyanide. 2 poisons, Wolfe. One's exotic, the other's final." Wolfe remained motionless. "You suspect accident. I suspect orchestration. And your hope is that I will compose the score?" "I'd settle for the first few bars." Kramer opened the folder. Also found a list, names, all Hungarian. Some flagged from immigration records, some not. Whatever this is, it's not just about a card trick gone wrong. Wolfe looked at the folder, not as if it might contain evidence, but as if it might contain dust. Kramer was 3 minutes into his monologue on Wolfe's civic duty when Wolfe interrupted, softly but with the precision of a scalpel. "Were the cards stained?" Kramer blinked. "What?" "Blood, wine, ash, any trace elements?" "No." "Then it was staged, theatrical, either a message to someone who would understand the pattern or the killer's signature." I glanced at Wolfe. "Meaning?" He waved a hand. "It means we mustn't reduce the gesture to absurdity. A performance is not the same as a confession." Kramer made a noise like someone swallowing gravel. "Fine," he said. "You want to play philosopher, go ahead. But you're not dancing around this one. If you know something—" "I know very little," Wolfe said smoothly. "But if you're intent on misinterpreting symbols, I suggest you consult a lexicon of semiotics." Kramer stood up. "And people wonder why I prefer corpses." I saw him out, then returned to find Wolfe precisely as I'd left him, except his eyes were now fixed on the list of names Kramer had left behind. One finger rested on a name halfway down. The next interruption didn't ring the bell. She walked in, ushered by Fritz with the reverence he usually reserves for a rare mushroom, and stopped just inside the doorway. She wore a smoke-colored wool coat with sleeves too long for her arms and a hat that hadn't been new this decade. Her face was pale, deliberate, and just sharp enough to leave an impression. "My name is Livia Harmat," she said. "I believe you knew my uncle." Wolfe didn't move. "We are becoming acquainted through circumstance?" She sat, uninvited. I noticed her gloves were clean, but her fingernails were bitten. "He told me he was going to speak with you," she continued. "But then I heard what happened." "You heard?" "I was called by the hotel and by the police. They questioned me. Wolfe studied her. "What is it you expect of me, Miss Harmat?" She looked down. "I don't know what to expect, only that my uncle was afraid he'd been receiving letters." "Threatening letters?" She nodded. "Signed only with a single letter." B. Wolfe's eyes closed briefly, as if absorbing the shape of that initial. Her voice trembled only once when she spoke of Budapest. She didn't call it home, she called it the place she left. "My uncle fled in 1950. He never said why, only that it was no longer possible to stay." Wolfe nodded once, as if that were the only honest sentence she'd spoken. She kept going. "He was cautious, suspicious, and he had enemies, people who called him a traitor, others who owed him favors." "What sort of favors?" I asked. "Ones that don't survive daylight?" Wolfe stirred, finally. "He was affiliated with the A-View?" Livia looked away. "He never said so, but I saw names, men he referred to only by nicknames." Wolfe leaned back, steepling his fingers. "And Mr. Cardos?" She hesitated. "He knew him, that much is certain, but he would never speak of him." Wolfe's brows lifted slightly. "The silence of guilt or fear?" "I don't know," she said. But the silence was loud. Wolfe was silent long after she'd finished speaking. When she reached into her purse and produced the letter, typed, unsigned, the signature a single bold B, he read it with the care of a man deciphering a weather pattern. "It is not recent," he said. "This was written months ago." "Yes, the first came in March." Wolfe's eyes narrowed. "Then your uncle delayed action." "Why?" She didn't answer. He handed me the letter, and I noted the typeface. Olympia, European, older model. I'd seen the same imprint on old political pamphlets at Columbia. Wolfe murmured, "History is never silent. It waits. Sometimes patiently, sometimes less so, but always it waits." And then he stood, a rare thing, and walked to the globe by the bookshelf. He spun it, lightly, then stilled it with a finger on Eastern Europe. "The geography remains," he said, "even when the names do not." It was Wolfe's voice that triggered the break, not the content, just the cadence. He asked a question plainly. "Did you know Emil Cardos prior to your arrival in this country?" Livia flinched. "Yes," she whispered. I leaned forward. "You knew him in Hungary?" She nodded barely. "I was 15, she said. "He was performing. On the street then, no stage, no tuxedo." "And you knew him?" "Everyone knew him," she said. "He could make things disappear." Wolfe's expression didn't change, but mine did. There was a tension in her voice that didn't match nostalgia. It matched something else, like she had spent years shoving that name into a drawer she'd now been forced to reopen. "He once made my father's watch vanish," she added. "He gave it back the next day, but when I opened the case, there was a picture inside that hadn't been there before." "What picture?" Wolfe asked softly. She shook her head. "I don't remember." Which, of course, meant she remembered far too well. And Wolfe, having sniffed the rot beneath the velvet, folded his hands and said nothing more. For now. The tea room on West 58th served tea so lukewarm it could have been bottled regret, but Emil Cardos didn't seem to notice. He was already halfway through a cucumber sandwich when I sat down, immaculately folded napkin balanced like a treaty across his lap. He gestured to the chair opposite, all practiced grace and European ease, as if we were old friends instead of two men trying to read each other's palms without touching them. "I assume you're here on behalf of Mr. Wolfe," he said, not bothering with pleasantries. "Tell me, has he developed a taste for theatrics?" "He prefers data to drama," I replied. "But he's willing to tolerate a little flair if there's poison in the script." That earned a smile. "You refer to Mr. Harmat?" I nodded. "You knew him?" He shrugged, elegant as a shrug can be. "Everyone knew Miklos, a nervous man with a talent for imagining his own persecution. Guilt makes ghosts, Mr. Goodwin. He was haunted." "He mentioned you by name?" Then perhaps he died of honesty, Cardos said softly, and returned to his tea. It wasn't an answer, but it was exactly the kind Wolfe would have expected. The address Cardos gave me for Josef Ax turned out to be a third-floor walk-up with paint that hadn't seen a brush since Truman was president. The door opened to a man who looked like he'd been working on a grudge for years and hadn't missed a shift. "You want to talk about him?" he said before I even asked the question. "Then you sit and you listen." I sat. He didn't. "Barna," he said, using the old name. "That's who he was, back in Budapest. I was the one who built the act. The disappearing dove, the candle into rose, the phantom scarf. Mine." He spat the word like it owed him money. "And Eva?" His eyes narrowed. She was mine too, until he made her vanish. Literally? Emotionally. She followed him out of the country and into the shadows. I let the silence do its work. It wasn't long before he filled it. He's not a magician. He's a thief with charm. And I'd bet whatever's left of my pride that Harmat died for knowing the truth. He didn't say more. He didn't have to. Verna Dougherty's apartment was one of those Fifth Avenue fortresses designed to keep out the weather and the poor. She welcomed me with a smile that had been rehearsed more often than some Broadway roles, and poured a liqueur I didn't drink, but held out of courtesy. "Cardos?" she said, eyes bright with calculation. "He's magnificent, a tragic mind inside a Baroque shell. I funded his tour because he reminded me that deception, when done well, is a kind of art." I let that dangle a second. "And Mr. Harmat?" Her smile faltered. "That was different. Miklos was a man who wanted forgiveness without ever admitting his crime." "What crime?" She took a sip, slower now. "He betrayed someone once. In Hungary. I don't know who, but it bought him his life." I asked if she knew about the photograph, the playing cards, the odd staging. She did not flinch. "You assume every performance has an audience. Sometimes the stage is private. Intimate." I stood to leave. She touched my sleeve. "Cardos is dangerous," she said quietly. "But not in the way you think. He keeps secrets the way others keep time." I thanked her. I didn't smile. Reverend Elijah Rusk had the kind of voice that could hollow out pews and turn stone to ash. He met me in the back room of a Harlem church that smelled of varnish and doctrine. His handshake was dry, his tone hotter. "You hear about the magician," he said, spitting the word like it had feathers. "Then I'll speak plain." "That's usually my department," I said, "but I'm open to partnerships." He scowled. "That man, Cardos, he came to one of our revival nights 3 months ago, said he wanted to offer a performance to draw in the curious. I was naive enough to allow it." "What happened?" He paced. "He had a boy come up, a child, asked him to think of someone who hurt him, then pretended to divine the name, said forgiveness was the greatest magic of all." Sounds harmless. It wasn't. The boy broke, screamed, ran. We haven't seen him since. His mother came to me 2 weeks later in tears. Said Cardos knew things he shouldn't. "Like what?" "Like secrets you only confess to God." Rusk crossed his arms. "That man doesn't deal in tricks. He deals in trespass." Wolfe didn't like Columbia professors. He said they were either self-impressed or institutionally sedated. But when the matter required translation of a torn sheet of Hungarian typewriting, he conceded that scholarship might be tolerable in short doses. The man we summoned to the brownstone was neither sedated nor impressed. He wore a herringbone suit that had seen more dictionaries than daylight, and he handled the paper as if it might bite him. "This," he said after 20 minutes and 2 glasses of Fritz's not-quite sherry, "is not just a list, it is a record." Wolfe's eyebrow performed its usual assent. Names, code names, real names beside them, affiliations, Alamvedelmi Hatosag, Arvo, secret police. He paused. "These are the men who made their countrymen disappear. Some now live here, changed names, changed cities, but the dates match post-revolution arrivals." Wolfe's expression remained unreadable, but his hand moved, barely, toward the edge of his desk blotter. a gesture not of surprise, but of intent. When the professor left, Wolfe said nothing. He didn't have to. The air in the room had changed. Retrieving the key had been easy. Harmat had left it tucked in his wallet like it was good for another lifetime. The box it opened belonged to the Empire Savings and Trust downtown, and the clerk handed it over with a stiff expression that said he'd seen worse secrets behind brass doors. Inside the box were only two things, a letter folded but unsigned, and the other half of the torn photograph. The letter could wait. The photo, now whole, showed Cardos and Harmat, not in suits and smiles, but in dark AVO uniforms, standing shoulder to shoulder in front of a nondescript stone building. The caption on the back, scribbled in Hungarian, dated it 1949. There was no mistaking them. Cardos had less silver in his hair and more edge in his eyes, but it was him. Wolfe would make something of that. I knew he would. I brought the photograph home in a manila envelope, and I brought the letter too, because when the past leaves breadcrumbs, you don't just follow the crumbs, you follow who dropped them and why. He took the photo without a word, laid it beside the translated list, and leaned back like a man examining the last page of a history book he hadn't written. Exile, he said after a moment. The great solvent. It erodes identity, alters memory, and justifies all manner of self-deceit. I nodded. You think Harmat and Cardos were part of the same machine? I think they built it, he replied. Then why would one want the other dead? He turned his gaze on me, cool as Riesling. Because when men rebuild themselves on lies, the truth becomes combustible. I sat down. That's poetic, but we don't have cause. We have context. That's more dangerous. He steepled his fingers, eyes narrowed. But guilt does not prove guilt. Motive is air, it fills every room. A murderer, Mr. Goodwin, must leave more than a shadow behind. The buzzer rang just then, breaking the thought. Wolfe didn't move. See who disturbs us now, he murmured, and whether they come to silence or to speak. Cardos had a rehearsal that night at a rented hall on East 36th, and Wolfe, having tired of theory without traction, instructed me to follow. Observe, but do not interrupt, he said, as if I'd planned to leap from the rafters. The venue was dusty and bare, rented by the hour, and lit like a hospital waiting room. Cardos's assistant let me in without argument. He recognized me and probably assumed I was scouting for column inches. I wasn't. I wanted answers that didn't vanish into smoke. Cardos was practicing something with mirrors and light. I watched for 10 minutes, just enough to wonder whether the illusion was the act or the man himself. When he stepped into the dressing room, I waited at the end of the hall. A minute passed, then another. The light under the door held steady. I pushed the door open, empty. No window, no trapdoor, no magician. Just a single playing card on the chair. The 9 of hearts. I stood there, feeling the floor for seams. Wolfe would call it theatrics. But it didn't feel like performance. It felt like warning. The morning's news arrived by phone, as most of Wolfe's mornings begin, against his will. This time, it was Lon Cohen of the Gazette, who usually called when someone interesting had died or when he wanted to know why Wolfe hadn't returned a message. Today, it was both. Joseph Axe, he said, strangled, last night, Midtown walk-up. Friend of yours? I asked. Not unless I changed careers and forgot. What's interesting about it? A feather, in the mouth. I admit, that got my attention. But it was the follow-up that cinched it. A deck of trick cards, marked and stacked, found in the man's coat. I thanked him and hung up. Wolfe was in the dining room, buttering toast like it was the last civil act left on earth. I relayed the details without garnish. He closed his eyes. Murder, already burdened with consequence, should never be encumbered with gesture. Theatricality undermines gravity. Unless it means something. Unless, he allowed. I didn't say it out loud, but we both knew the implication. First Harmat, now Axe, both connected to Cardos, and both served a farewell laced with performance. And if a killer was staging scenes, it meant we were still in Act 1. I laid out the report from the scene. Strangulation clean and professional, no signs of struggle, no prints on the cards. The feather, white and small, could have come from any stage pigeon in Manhattan, or a pillow if the killer lacked flair. But the placement, tucked gently into the mouth, suggested deliberation, not desperation. Wolfe pressed the tips of his fingers together beneath his chin and frowned. "There is a species of mind," he said, "that believes murder can be elevated by metaphor. It is the same species that paints landscapes on coffins. Meaning the feather was symbolic? Meaning it was indulgent," he snapped. "This is no longer an affair of necessity, it is now theatre." I agreed, but kept the thought to myself that our suspect list wasn't exactly lacking in dramatists. Cardos, Verna Daugherty, even that preacher with the stovepipe lungs. Wolfe turned his gaze toward the office window, not looking out, just into the middle distance where his deductions like to gather before forming ranks. "If the killer is leaving tokens," he said, "we must determine whether they are cues for the audience or warnings for the cast." By noon, the press had christened it, "The Magician Murders." The phrase turned Wolfe's mouth down like a spoiled soufflé. I heard it first on the radio, then again on a bulletin Fritz brought in on a silver tray with the midday consommé. At 2:15, the front door opened without a knock, which meant it was Kramer. He entered without ceremony and deposited himself into the red armchair like a complaint you couldn't return. He was wearing the same suit as the day before, only angrier. "You knew about Axe," he said, without prelude. "And you didn't call." Wolfe did not rise. "I am not clairvoyant, Inspector. I merely read." "And you read that the man had a feather in his mouth?" "Number that, you've just confirmed," Kramer growled. "We've got cameras circling the theatre, reporters camped outside Cardos's hotel. If someone sneezes into a silk handkerchief, it's front page." "I find that repugnant," Wolfe said. "Murder should be mourned, not marketed." Kramer's eyes narrowed. "Then help me stop the next one." Wolfe said nothing, but his fingers tapped once on the armrest, his version of a handshake. The next move would be his. I could tell. It wasn't often that Wolfe summoned me with a raised voice. Most of his requests arrive in tones better suited to cathedral murmurs, but this one had an edge. When I entered the office, he was seated behind his desk with the torn letter Livia had brought and the translated list from the Columbia Scholar, both laid flat before him like relics from a less civilized century. "Archie," he said, "the letter signed B was not anonymous." It was deliberate. He tapped the page with a forefinger. "Brody, the name appears on the list once, under the section titled Facilitators. It is not a surname, it is a code designation." I didn't blink. "Meaning?" "Meaning our mysterious correspondent was either the sender or the subject of that designation. Either would be sufficient to ignite a vendetta." I whistled low. "So Harmat was being warned, or threatened, by someone who once shared a regime with him, or shared its disgrace." He reclined a fraction. "It is one thing to escape tyranny, another to find yourself exposed by the same machinery that once preserved you." "And you think Cardos is Brody?" "I think Cardos may know who is," Wolfe said quietly, "which makes him vulnerable, and makes Livia's silence untenable." I headed straight to the Regis Hotel, where Miss Livia Harmat had been staying under a name just Eastern European enough to sound dignified. The concierge, one of those chinless wonders who measures worth by wristwatch weight, gave me a look usually reserved for guests who ask for ice in their burgundy. "Miss Harvath checked out," he said, or rather, she departed. "Without her luggage?" I asked. He blinked. "Number, her belongings remain, but she has not returned since the evening before." He let me into the room, reluctantly. The air smelled faintly of lilac water and something sharper, fear maybe, though I doubt he'd recognize it. Her suitcase sat unopened in the corner. Her passport lay on the vanity like an invitation never mailed. The cosmetics were neatly arrayed, and beside them, on hotel stationery, was a torn scrap with 8 slanted words in blue ink. I remember now. He lied. I'm sorry. The tone was wrong for suicide, and too right for revelation. I called Wolfe. His voice came through the receiver like static in silk. Bring the note, and come directly. Whatever dance had begun between Cardos and the past, it was no longer slow. Queen's has its own kind of silence. It settles on stoops and clings to shawls, and if you know where to knock, it will answer, slowly. Her name was Mrs. Elek, and she answered the door like someone expecting a knock from God or the past, whichever arrived first. I told her I was looking into the history of Emil Cardos. Her eyes narrowed into time-worn slits, and for a moment she stood very still. Bana Janos, she said. That was his name then. She gestured me in. The apartment smelled of onion, old rugs, and memory. She poured tea, but didn't offer sugar. Street performer, she continued. Played at Newgate Station with a violin that squeaked like a rat. But his real trade was information. He pointed fingers, bought bread that way. I asked if she'd known Harmat. He paid him once, she said. To erase a name, I don't know whose. And Cardos? She looked out the window. He survived. That's what he always did. Survive. The way she said it, you could have mistaken it for praise. But it wasn't. It was indictment, without trial. Back at the brownstone, I found Wolfe in the plant room, silent among his orchids like a judge considering whether to call a mistrial on the human race. When I brought him the note and relayed what Mrs. Elek had told me, he made a sound that could have passed for a sigh or a curse, depending on his mood. He returned to the office and sat, closing his eyes. I have said before, he murmured, that history waits. But when it moves, it does so with choreography. I took that to mean he was thinking. Livia, he said slowly, vanishes without luggage, leaves a note that indicates regained memory and betrayal. Cardos, in turn, vanishes from a locked room. Harmat is killed theatrically. Axe is killed more so. What do they share? I offered the obvious. Budapest, 1949, and guilt, apparently. No, Wolfe said, eyes still closed. They share a script, one being followed now, not written then, and someone intends to see the last act performed. Starring whom? I asked. He didn't open his eyes. That remains to be cast. It was nearly midnight when the knock came. Not the bell, not the phone, just a soft, insistent knock that reached past the walls and into the spine. Fritz brought in the parcel, small and wrapped in plain brown paper, tied with string like it had come from a grocer. No return address, no sender, just the name, N. Wolfe, typed cleanly on a white label. Wolfe didn't flinch as he sliced the paper. Inside, a severed dove's wing, blood dried at the bone, laid atop a white card no larger than a playing deck. 6 words printed in red ink. The final illusion begins. Watch closely. Wolfe held the card between thumb and forefinger, not like it disgusted him, but like it bored him. Well, he said at last, our dramatist has declared his climax. I watched the wing, stiff and deliberate, and said nothing. There were messages and there were declarations. This one, I felt, was both. And Wolfe, of course, had already begun assembling the answer, quietly, in the theatre of his mind. Wolfe doesn't often pick up the phone himself. When he does, it's either bad news or business requiring the kind of discretion that only a man with a reputation like his can command. On this particular morning, the call was both. He sat behind his massive desk, the scent of his morning coffee mingling with the sharper notes of his orchids, and dialed a number no one else would dare. The recipient was a man retired from the shadows, an ex-OSS operative named Ellis, who owed Wolfe more than a few favors from the war years. Wolfe needed someone who could profile the kind of man who reinvents himself repeatedly, who could dissect the psyche of a ghost wearing the name Bana Janos. Ellis, Wolfe began, his voice a measured baritone, I require your expertise on a matter where history's ghosts are wearing new masks. Ellis answered with the gravelly tone of a man who had heard more secrets than sermons. Wolfe laid out the bare bones of the case, a magician with a shadowed past, a roster of names tied to Hungary's dark past, and a string of deaths staged like acts in a macabre performance. "I want you to tell me what kind of man becomes a phantom in this way," Wolfe concluded. "What drives him? What keeps him hiding in plain sight?" The line went silent for a moment. Then Ellis replied, "I'll see what the ghosts whisper, Wolfe." "Consider it done." Wolfe hung up and turned to me, already immersed in thought. "The past," he murmured, "has a long reach, and sometimes it calls in debts with interest." I knew then we were not chasing mere shadows, but contending with a ghost story that demanded answers. Following Wolfe's lead, I spent the next morning immersed in dusty diplomatic archives and émigré records, digging through arrivals and departures, deaths recorded in absentia, and birth certificates that looked as if they'd been forged with a broomstick. Then I found it. Emil Kardos was officially dead. The date on the death certificate was August 15th, 1956, Budapest. No grave, no funeral, no obituary save the faintest whisper in a government registry. Wolfe had mentioned that faking one's death was the magician's greatest trick, but this was something else entirely, a vanishing act performed not on stage, but in the ledger books of nations. I folded the paper carefully and brought it back to the brownstone. Wolfe didn't look surprised. "A man who wishes to disappear in such a manner," he said, "is either a coward or a strategist. I incline to the latter." "And you think he reappeared here?" "I think he plays with more than cards, Mr. Goodwin." Verna Daugherty was a woman of many layers. Her apartment gleamed with polished silver and the heavy scent of jasmine. When Wolfe rang her, I followed with a confident knock that said I was not to be brushed off easily. She answered with the poise of a practiced actress, but the veil slipped when Wolfe's name came up. There was a brief hesitation, a tightening of the eyes. In a quiet moment, Wolfe's questions laid bare the truth. Verna had helped Kardos escape Hungary, buying his silence about her own collaborations with the AVO during the dark years. She admitted it without bitterness, just a resigned pragmatism that comes from knowing what debts are unpayable in full. "I did what was necessary to survive," she told me later, her voice soft but firm. "And sometimes survival requires deals with the devil." Wolfe considered this and said, "Survival is an art, but one cannot paint over a stained canvas forever." I left her apartment feeling that the stakes had risen sharply and that our magician had a patron willing to pull strings from the shadows. After the call with Verna, Wolfe retreated to his plant rooms. For 4 hours, I heard nothing but the quiet click of a trowel, the faint drip of water, and the occasional shuffle of his immense bulk moving among the orchids. I tried not to let the silence get to me, though Kramer's 2 unanswered voicemails suggested that patience was wearing thin on more than one front. Wolfe emerged as dusk fell, pale, somber, and unspeaking for a time. When he finally spoke, it was with the gravity of a man who had been wrestling ghosts. "Each death," he said, "is a calculated move in a game of misdirection. We are not dealing with chaos, but with design." I knew from experience that when Wolfe vanished into silence like this, the resolution was either imminent or impossible to escape. Wolfe paced the office like a man walking a tightrope strung between reason and madness. The playing cards, the staged deaths, the threatening letters, they were not cries for attention, but calculated diversions. "The killer," he said, "is performing a reversed card trick. They frame the innocent by projecting guilt backward, casting shadows where none belong." He spoke of misdirection and psychological acrobatics, painting a picture where every gesture was a clue and every clue a distraction. "And Livia," he added, "is at the center of this legerdemain, whether she knows it or not." I listened, feeling the slow tightening of the noose and the inevitability of revelation. Just as Wolfe finished outlining his theory, the telephone shattered the thick silence. I answered. Livia Harmat's voice trembled over the line, Not the composed woman who'd visited us, but a frightened girl trapped behind walls she had not chosen. She wasn't calling from a hotel or a friend's place. She was in the brownstone kitchen, hiding. "Archie," she whispered, "I need help. I have to tell you everything." I glanced at Wolfe, who had already risen, eyes sharp and calculating. The game was no longer a distant puzzle. It was here, in our own house. She stood at the far end of the kitchen, barely a silhouette against the morning's grey wash. Pale didn't begin to describe her. She looked like she'd been drained by memory itself. I didn't speak. I let her start, and after a moment, she did. "I loved him," she said quietly. "Not the way a woman loves a man. The way a girl loves someone who seems to know the world." She meant Cardos. Her voice said everything her posture tried not to. He would perform in the square Yetzer with coins, with scarves, with stories. Everyone stopped to watch, even my father. Wolfe said nothing, but his gaze sharpened. "One night I followed them, Emile and 2 others. I saw them at my door. I didn't know what it meant. Then she faltered. "He brought my father out in handcuffs." Her voice broke, not loudly, more like a hinge snapping under pressure. "I forgot it for years, or tried to." Wolfe murmured, "And memory, like the dead, does not remain buried forever." She nodded. He lied, to all of us. That, apparently, was the key that unlocked a drawer she'd spent 20 years keeping shut. Wolfe doesn't send invitations so much as he dispatches inevitabilities. By mid-afternoon, I was on the phone with 4 individuals who had no business sitting in the same room unless handcuffs were involved. To Cardos, I offered a chance to clear his name. To Verna Doherty, a discreet opportunity to defend her reputation. To Reverend Rusk, the suggestion that truth would exonerate faith. And to Kramer, well, I simply said Wolfe had gathered everyone and wouldn't speak without the inspector present. Each took the bait for a different reason. Some out of pride, some out of fear, and Kramer out of the sheer instinct that if Wolfe was staging something, he'd better damn well supervise. Wolfe, meanwhile, remained behind his desk, drafting the seating like a man arranging pieces on a chessboard where only one color would remain standing at the end. By the time dusk fell, the office was set, the air was taut, and I had the quiet sense that we were no longer dealing in conjecture, but closing in on the weight of truth. The instant Kramer stepped into the room and saw the assembled suspects, his face went from florid to volcanic in about 2 seconds flat. "This is a goddamn performance," he growled, "not an inquiry." Wolfe, immobile and sphinx-like, offered a single arch of an eyebrow. "I do not perform, Inspector," he said mildly. "I reveal. You drag in half the suspects, line them up like a drawing-room farce, and expect me to stand here while you play master of ceremonies? I expect you to listen." Kramer planted his feet. "I want warrants for Cardos and Verna Doherty. 2 deaths, 2 motives, and now a confession that's probably being rehearsed somewhere in this room." "You want the obvious," Wolfe replied, "because it is comfortable. But I assure you, comfort has no bearing on accuracy." Kramer opened his mouth again, but I caught his sleeve and nodded once. "Let him finish," I said. "If it's a circus, at least the ringmaster's sober." That earned me a scowl. But he folded his arms and stayed put. The room by then had gone so still you could hear guilt breathing. Wolfe did not raise his voice. He never needed to. It was the silence that followed each sentence that carried the weight. "The playing cards," he began, "were not merely symbolic. They were an inversion, a message for one person, hidden behind a tableau." He gestured to the table, where I had laid out the photographic reproduction of the card arrangement. The Queen of Hearts reversed, the 9 of Spades at her feet, and the Fool at an angle. Not random, Wolfe insisted, but intentional. "Viewed as a reversed tarot," he said, "they represent the destruction of innocence, the concealment of grief, and the mockery of wisdom." He turned to Livia. "You were meant to understand them." "And you did." Her hands trembled in her lap, eyes fixed on the desk blotter, as if it might vanish. Wolfe's voice dropped, gentle but merciless. Someone led you back to memory through metaphor, that someone knew you had buried the truth. But a buried truth does not cease to exist. It waits. She didn't speak. She didn't need to, because now every person in the room was watching her, and only her. Wolfe leaned forward just enough to command the room without leaving his chair. Miklos Harmat, he said, did not die from scopolamine. That merely paralyzed him. It was cyanide that killed him. I could hear the soft intake of breath from someone, I think Werner. But Wolfe pressed on. Scopolamine, in controlled doses, induces compliance and amnesia. It leaves the body still, but the mind suggestible. It is a tool, not a weapon. He looked at Livia. You knew the dosage because you read your uncle's medical files. He suffered from a heart condition. You knew just how much would pacify without killing. She didn't deny it, Wolfe continued. Cyanide, however, is unforgiving. It must be delivered cleanly, swiftly, and with access. Only one person had the proximity, the emotional motive, and the opportunity. Kramer stepped forward. You're saying... I am saying, Wolfe cut in, that the killer was not a magician, but a grieving niece who remembered too late and acted too soon. Livia's hand went to her purse, not suddenly, but with a quiet finality. The room braced itself for what would come out. Her fingers emerged with something small and black. Not a gun, not a vial, but a wand. The kind magicians use to direct the audience's attention elsewhere while the trick unfolds behind the curtain. She held it for a moment, staring at the polished wood as though it might still carry the weight of her childhood enchantment. Then, without ceremony, she dropped it onto the rug. It bounced once, then settled, and she wept. Not dramatically, not in search of pity, but like a woman who had carried too much and was suddenly, painfully, unable to carry more. Wolfe did not speak. Nor did I. Even Kramer, whose instinct was always to fill silences with suspicion, stood, with arms slackened at his sides. The wand had not been evidence, it had been a memory. And now it was a confession. The spell, as Wolfe would later say, had finally broken, but I wasn't sure who among us had actually cast it. She sat low in Wolfe's armchair, not just physically, but spiritually, the way a confession can hollow a person before the words even reach the air. Livia Harmat was no longer the elegant shadow who had walked into our office days ago. She was reduced to something raw, pulled from the past like a bone from a fire. I did it, she said, her voice barely brushing the edges of audibility. I poisoned him. Wolfe didn't respond. He let silence do the asking. She looked down, as if the floor might hold an absolution it didn't. He told me the truth, about Budapest, that he had protected Cardos, paid someone off, pulled strings. He called it mercy. I called it betrayal. Her fingers twisted together in her lap. I wanted him to face it. I didn't want to kill him, only to scare him. The scopolamine was for that, just that. But then... She paused, and the pause was heavier than anything she could have said. I changed it. I added the cyanide. Wolfe remained still. Livia looked up. I couldn't bear that he let him go. After what he did to my father. I couldn't let it go unpunished. And just like that, the motive came clean. Not from rage, but from something colder. Memory. I'd seen Wolfe silent plenty of times, mid-thought, mid-meal, mid-refusal to be bothered, but this silence was something else entirely. He hadn't blinked since Livia's confession settled like dust in the air. He wasn't angry, nor satisfied, nor even particularly contemplative. He was listening inward, I suspected, to the echo of something he hadn't liked hearing. Livia sat, drained of defiance, her voice spent. I stood, unsure whether to speak or wait for Wolfe's machinery to click into motion. Eventually, I said what needed saying. Well, that about does it, Wolfe stirred. Does it? He asked, almost absently. It closes the loop. He exhaled, a long, slow thread of breath. Number it, phrase it. This was not vengeance. It was justice distorted by private grief. Still gets a conviction. It gets a verdict, he corrected. A conviction is something more internal. I didn't argue because I knew the look in Wolfe's eyes. He wasn't done, not entirely. And I was starting to feel that uncomfortable clarity that in this case nobody came out clean. Not Harmat, not Cardos, and not the woman who sat shattered in his chair. Emil Cardos, or Bana Janos as he had once been, stood in Wolfe's office like a man who knew the curtain had dropped on a performance he hadn't wanted to give. He wasn't theatrical anymore, no cape, no velvet timbre in his voice. Just the quiet fatigue of someone whose past had finally caught up at a slower pace than expected. I was a street performer, he said, in Budapest, before the war. Afterward, I adapted. When the world becomes a stage for survival, you learn which tricks matter. Wolfe watched him, unmoving. They offered me a choice, Cardos continued. Names or exile. I gave them names. Freely? Wolfe asked. No, he said. And that was the first honest note I'd heard from him. But not under duress, either. It was a transaction. I chose to live. He met Wolfe's eyes. And I've lived ever since expecting someone to find me. A knock at the door, a face from a vanished street. I glanced at Wolfe, half expecting judgment. But Wolfe only nodded once. Fear is the cost of anonymity, he said, and the currency of truth. When Wolfe made the offer, I blinked. You're serious, I said. Do I jest, Mr. Goodwin? Not often, and never when the suggestion involves shielding a confessed informant from a press eager to turn him into another headline stitched with Cold War thread. I will contact a man I trust, Wolfe said, who can see that Mr. Janos is relocated discreetly for his safety. Cardos, no, Bana, looked almost too tired to be grateful. Why? He asked, not suspiciously, but with the weariness of someone who never expected leniency again. Because, Wolfe said, your guilt is real, but it was never hidden. That makes you anomalously honest in a drama defined by concealment. I watched the exchange and said nothing. Wolfe wasn't being noble. He was preserving the architecture of the case, not its actors. Still, it was the closest he'd come to mercy in a long time. Cardos nodded. I'll disappear again, if that's what you prefer. Wolfe lifted a brow. Only this time, do it quietly. The dead have had enough drama. Kramer arrived just in time to be furious, which meant the schedule was holding. He took one look at the room, Livia still pale and unmoving, Cardos unnaturally subdued, and turned his full indignation on Wolfe. You sit on this for 2 days, and now you hand it over like it's a wrapped gift? Wolfe gestured at Livia. I present the culprit, the confession, and the context. She poisoned her own uncle? Wolfe nodded, deliberately, after learning he had shielded a man she believed responsible for her father's arrest. Kramer grunted. Another tragic woman in silk. What is it now, every third one? He looked at me. You ever consider switching to bank fraud? At least they don't cry when you book 'em. I'll keep it in mind, I said. He rubbed his temples. This one's going to be a circus. Wolfe said nothing, and Livia, still seated, offered no resistance as the officers stepped in. She simply stood, nodded once to Wolfe, and walked out as though she had nothing left to lose, which, in her mind, she probably didn't. Wolfe and I were alone again, the brownstone returning to its usual rhythm of creaks and silences. I was halfway through putting away the notes when I asked, So what tipped it for you? He took a moment. Then, a word. I waited. She used the term gyanakodtam, he said. It means I suspected, but the form she used was idiomatic, too familiar for a non-native. And yet, she had always claimed to have left Hungary at 8. Couldn't she have remembered it? She used it reflexively, as a native speaker might. But more important, she used it at a moment when she was pretending to forget. He looked at me, eyes narrowed. Language is memory, and memory, in her case, was the crime. I nodded slowly. The confession, the guilt, the motive, all of it had been buried in grammar. And Wolfe, damn him, had caught it. We didn't say anything more that night. Some truths, once unearthed, don't need to be turned over again. If truth is a gentleman, then Wolfe had dressed it in a vest and seated it centre stage. We were all in the office, Kramer perched on the red leather chair like it had personally insulted him, Livia hunched into herself beside the globe stand, and Cardos still wearing that poker face I wouldn't want to play against, sober or otherwise. Wolfe, of course, didn't rise. He didn't need to. His voice did the work. "This room," he began, "has been the site of many fictions unraveled. Let us not disgrace it now with silence." Kramer huffed, but Wolfe raised a hand. "You, Inspector, have your duty. I have mine, to reconstruct the edifice, brick by brick, of what truly occurred." He turned his gaze on Cardos, then Livia. "You both wove illusions, one to mislead, the other to remember selectively." Livia flinched just slightly. Cardos didn't move. Wolfe folded his hands over his girth. "Let us proceed not with drama, but with sequence. The illusion was not the crime. The illusion was the stage. And just like that, the room wasn't a room. It was the end of a performance, and Wolfe was preparing his closing act. "Illusion," Wolfe said, "is the art of making the eye see what the mind doubts. Mr. Cardos, you are guilty of many things, but not of murder." Kramer leaned forward, his moustache twitching. "Says you." "Says the evidence," Wolfe countered. "The cards, the feathers, the symbolic grotesquerie. They were his creation, yes. But they were not the act of murder. They were staging, misdirection." He glanced toward Livia without needing to. "You built the theatre, Mr. Cardos. But the murder was performed by another. The trick you constructed was meant to protect yourself from suspicion. But you underestimated the passion of those near you." Cardos, to his credit, remained silent. His eyes met Wolfe's, steady and tired. "The error," Wolfe continued, "was not the performance. It was allowing the curtain to rise when the stage had not been cleared. Even Kramer didn't argue that one. Wolfe's voice had the gravity of inevitability, and the illusion that didn't kill had, in the end, paved the way for someone who could." Wolfe leaned back, hands steepled, voice deliberate. "There is a difference," he said, "between perception and truth. The former is the magician's domain. The latter belongs to the murderer." I've heard Wolfe wax philosophical before, over shad roe, over beer, once even while watching a debate on television, but there was something surgical in the way he carved this thought. "A magician leads the eye," he went on, "but a killer leads the soul, down a path paved with just enough resemblance to reality to make the lie feel like memory." He paused to let that one settle. "In this case, perception masked guilt, not Cardos's, but Livia's. He built a stage, yes, but she stepped into the spotlight alone, in silence, and with full knowledge of what she would do." Livia didn't speak. She didn't even flinch, but her hand, resting on the chair's arm, twitched once. Wolfe's voice softened. "Guilt, real guilt, does not shout, it whispers, and it is that whisper that solved this crime." For a moment, the room held its breath, because no one dared be the first to exhale. Kramer stood, nodded to his men, and Livia followed them out without a word. Her heels struck the parquet in even, deliberate rhythm, but they couldn't disguise the tremor in her spine. Wolfe didn't blink. He rarely does when the play ends. Cardos watched her go, his face impassive, but the kind of impassive that's built layer by layer out of years spent hiding from mirrors. I stood back, arms folded, and wondered what kind of man could keep quiet this long. When the door shut behind her, Wolfe reached, not for beer, not for his book, but for the edge of the armrest. That was all. Just a hand resting there. The quiet kind of punctuation only Wolfe knew how to use. "Do you think she'll talk?" I asked. Wolfe didn't answer. And maybe that was the point. The curtain had fallen, and whether the audience applauded or not, the actors had already left the stage. I stayed a while after they left. Wolfe didn't speak, and I didn't fill the silence. Some moments don't ask for conversation. They ask for a kind of reverence, or maybe restraint. The facts had aligned, the motives had declared themselves. But what lingered was less the case, and more the debris it left behind. Livia's confession wasn't the key, it was the lock, the thing that kept everything else from falling apart too soon. She hadn't just killed to avenge a betrayal. She'd killed to reassert a story she could live with. And Wolfe, damn him, had pulled the thread until the fabric gave way. I turned over a card that had been left on the corner table. A queen, spades, not the one from the window. That would come later. But it struck me nonetheless. "What do we forget to survive?" I asked aloud. Wolfe grunted. "Whatever is necessary." And I knew better than to ask again, because sometimes lies aren't told to others, they're told inward, the way a stagehand whispers cues, even when the play is done. As the sun slouched its way down toward the west side, and the rug beneath us turned the color of dried wine, Wolfe finally reached for his beer. It had warmed to the temperature of disappointment, but he drank it anyway, one deliberate sip. "Illusion," he said softly, "is the only honest art." That one got my attention. He set the glass down, eyes half-lidded. Because it never pretends to be truth, it only asks that you wish it were. I leaned against the bookcase, arms crossed. "You feeling poetic tonight?" "Hardly," he replied. "But you may record the line, it deserves survival." I nodded, and I realized, for all the layers, for all the peeling back of motives and facades, Wolfe wasn't angry. He wasn't even particularly triumphant. He was, for once, simply tired of watching people lie and calling it protection. And in that moment, I almost agreed with him. Almost. The office had gone quiet, the kind of quiet that felt earned rather than imposed. I gathered my notes, straightened the books Wolfe had left slightly askew, and then glanced at the windowsill. There it was, a single playing card, caught between the sash and the breeze, fluttering like the ghost of a last thought. Queen of Hearts, face up, untouched. I considered retrieving it, but something held me back. Maybe it was the symmetry of it. One last illusion, not made by hand but left by fate. Or maybe I just didn't want to be the one who moved it. "Leave it," Wolfe said without looking up. So I did. And in that moment, with the case closed, the rooms emptied, and June whispering in through the glass, I realized some mysteries end in a name, some in a motive, and some, the rarest kind, end with a question. Not one we answer, one we live with. In the quiet that follows justice, there are no cheers, only the soft scrape of memory folding itself away. A woman wept for a truth too long buried. A man bowed beneath the weight of names he once whispered in exchange for bread. And Wolfe, unshaken as ever, left the final word to a playing card dancing in the dusk. There are crimes we commit, and others we inherit. But illusion, he said, at least admits it lies. Do you believe guilt can live in silence for years, and still strike clean when memory returns? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoyed the mystery, be sure to like the video, share it with someone who loves detective stories, and subscribe for more. Not every case ends with applause, but the truth, once found, always echoes.